Welcome back to the Berg podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're checking in with Scott Gross. Scott Gross is the superintendent for our commercial division. Most of you have had the chance to meet him. So today I've got myself, Bryan. With me is Dan.
Hey, everybody.
And our special guest, Scott.
Hey.
Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you.
Hey, so we don't do this real often, but we've had a chance recently to chat with a couple people from the field, and it's nice to get some different perspective. And so what I'd like to do, Scott, if I start with you, just start is just kind of talk us a little bit about your background, and then we'll sort of transition to how you got to Berg Construction.
Okay. Yeah, I started out as a general laborer a long time ago. And I realized that I enjoyed doing pipe work, so I got myself onto a pipe crew as a top man.
Yeah, well, so tell me, what attracted you to pipe work specifically?
I think I just like the deep trenches. It seemed like you were really doing a lot of work. And I realized after I was there, sometimes at the end of the day, you don't really see what you've accomplished because it's all buried. But I did like doing that. So I actually grew into a pipe layer where I laid all the pipe. I learned to do, so basically as a pipe layer, you learn to fill in for your pipe foreman. That's where you want to get to. And so then an opening came for pipe foreman. So I advanced to that
Sort of
after a few years.
Natural progression.
Yep.
Yeah.
And after a few years of that, I think around 7-8 years as pipe foreman, I stepped up to be a site supervisor. So, and then you're in charge of all aspects of the site each day.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So what was that transition like for you? I mean, pipe foreman, you're watching over your crew. Site supervisor could have multiple crews, multiple foremen.
Yeah. Yes, just a lot more responsibility. You have a lot less time to get your hands on it than you do as you know, when you're a pipe foreman. You have a lot of time to be right there with the crews.
Yeah,
you have to have a lot more trust when you're the site supervisor because you can't be right there all the day.
Got to trust your teammates, and you probably, I would assume, takes a little more intentional organization and sort of forecasting.
Yeah, a lot of planning.
Yeah. So you did that. Was that with one company, a handful of companies?
It's multiple companies.
Yeah.
I was with Brubacher for quite a few years, about 18. I also was with Schlock for a few years, Technovate. There's a few others before those, but and then I came here.
Yeah.
So.
And if I remember correctly, you were a referral, right? We had an employee.
Yes.
Said it was a good opportunity.
Yeah, he said that they were looking for somebody, and I was a little unhappy where I was at that point. Felt like I was somebody really looking over my shoulder all the time and putting a lot of pressure, and I didn't like that feeling. And I was told that it wouldn't be that way here, and so I thought I'd give it a try.
Yeah, and that's a really funny story, right? I mean, that's we're a relatively young company. We think that. We're still trying to find the right size, but we think we're pretty close to it in regards to who we are as an organization, where we fit in regards to the type of work we do, et cetera. But one of the things we figured out about ourselves, and I've only been here 7, Dan, you're about 9 years. And is we are really comfortable typically with giving a lot of freedom, not a lot of oversight, and really trust our folks, right?
Yeah, it's one of the things it's really, I always say it's a hallmark of us is that we want to give autonomy. We want to let people feel like they're owners, act as an owner, own your piece, do your job, sort of all those little phrases that we've come up with along the way. And we realized at some point that we have to be careful with giving that kind of freedom. We would do it. And then Bryan's actually brought it up with me that I very easily delegate. I can delegate very easily as, okay, this person's going to do this. And then I give virtually no support at times to help them to do the thing I asked them to do. I just said, please go do this thing. And I believe you can do it. And I trust that you can do it. And I don't follow up enough. And I don't, and I've had to get better at that. But Scott was actually one of the first people that it really hit me that before that, we did not have tons of experienced people. That was the old school of us with farmer mentality. It was a bunch of guys who really just wanted to get things done. And we'd go to work and we might not work the smartest, but we'd work the hardest and we would see things through. And we were at a transitional point with the company where we were starting to really deal with GCs and owners who were going to require us to be able to do certain things and meet certain deadlines. And we needed to really start to put some foremen in place and some superintendents in place who could manage those jobs. So when I heard Scott coming available, just looking at his resume, it was like, this is exactly the guy we need. Like he knows every piece of what we do. He's done it for big companies. He's done it at a small company, and he's looking for autonomy. This is perfect. Um, and so I sort of remember. I don't remember things perfectly, but I sort of remember when we sat down with Scott, and I said, like, I'm gonna give you the autonomy that you're looking for. You're gonna go out there. You're gonna own your piece. You just do what you have to do, and you're not gonna have me looking over your shoulder. And then we made it. In my head, it was a couple weeks. I don't know if it was 10 days or 3 weeks. Who knows? But Brad came to me and he said, "Hey, can you just check in with Scott? He's like a little uneasy. I forget what the words Brad used were, but like Scott might be unhappy." And so I was like, "All right, well, I don't know why you'd be unhappy. Is everything okay?" And he said, "Yeah, I think so." So I went down to see Scott, and he was down at a job in Malvern, and I drove in, and I went to check on Scott, and I said, "Hey, how are things going?" And Scott said they're going good, and we had a quick conversation, and then I think Scott said to me, "Are you like unhappy with me?" And I was like, "No, are you unhappy here? Like I heard you might not be happy." And he said, "Well, you haven't checked on me. You didn't you haven't checked to see if anything's going well, how I'm doing." And I was like, "Well, we had a discussion about it. I said, like, I'm not going to check on you." So it was a really funny interaction because I was purposely giving Scott maybe even more room than I would somebody else because his resume said he wasn't going to need me to watch him. He knows far more than I know about anything that he's doing. Um, but even in that scenario with a very experienced person, they still were a little unsettled, and maybe Scott can speak to that, a little unsettled, but just how much freedom and willingness to just say, okay, you go do it.
Yeah, it was just, I was used to having somebody looking over my shoulder all the time and just checking to make sure, hey, he did it, or he did that the way I wanted him to, or whatever. And there was none of that. So, which I'm okay with, but it just didn't feel right.
It just felt out of place, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
which is interesting because we oftentimes don't think about that perspective when we transition people into our organization. They've probably come from somewhere where clearly they didn't do it like us or did a different variation of the thing we do. And typically what we hear is people like to have that freedom, like to have that trust in what they're able to do, and let their performance be sort of the proof, right? But sometimes I think, that like your story here, yeah, a little, maybe a little shocked about how much rope they're given
Well, and I
at
think,
times.
I've had to learn that there is a big difference between empowering somebody, to feel like they are capable, not capable, but they are allowed, they are free to do this thing and give them as much room as they need because they know what they're doing, and just telling them that they're autonomous. There's a big difference between just sending Scott to that job and just saying, "Hey, go out and do it. Call me if you need me," and providing him enough support and formality that he feels empowered to go do it. And that's something I've had to work through in figuring out how to better hand that off. And some of the guys that have come on board, including Scott, help me with that because they're more formal and they're going to follow up and they're going to give these guys the support. And it's really one of the things we saw pretty quickly with Scott was that he was able to he did really well on his first project, which none of the projects are ideal. Like we talk about this often on the podcast, and we talk about it certainly with the teams and in foreman meetings. If there's a perfect piece of land left in the middle of King of Prussia, it's not so perfect.
Oh, yeah,
There's
right.
the good sites are taken; they're already built. Almost every one you run into now, Scott's going to have to deal with a problem.
Still not making more land, right? So
They
yeah,
haven't made any more land lately. So uh, as we got started, we started to see, okay, Scott's doing a good job running a job, but he's actually running that job even better than we're running other jobs. And so opportunity sort of knocked. And it had to be a conscious decision between the group, between the company and between Scott willing to take a shot on taking on more responsibility. But we've started to move down that road. And that is one of the things I want to hit on here is what Scott's progression has looked like. So Scott comes in to the company and he's going to be a operating foreman. He's going to run a job site, be in a piece of equipment, back owning the full site, not just the pipe, but the full site. Um, and I don't know, did you make it out of one job? I think you made it out of one job before we recognized that we needed to
Ye
promote.
yeah, we talked about it towards the end of that first job.
So, we talked about it and you were open to the idea that you would take on more responsibility. And Scott actually did one of the ideal things we like to see in the company, which is not that you're willing to do more work than you're being paid for, but rather that you're willing to take ownership and say, like, I would like to be this thing and I'm going to work towards it. And then we jointly try and get you to the point where you have both the compensation, the tools, the people, and the position and the title to be able to make the jump. And at this point, we can go with the stops along the way. But the reality is, over the past year, Scott has moved and Scott has become the general superintendent of commercial. He's not yet general superintendent of everything because we don't set it up that way. We keep the division separated a little bit. But in terms of commercial, everything operationally runs through Scott. Uh, you know, he is by every measure the general superintendent of commercial on at Berg Construction, and that's a role we never even had before. We had to figure out what that role looked like, um, what it needed, what Scott would need, what sort of support he needed, all these other things that we really had to figure out along the way with Scott trying to maintain and hold down that job. So that's one of the things I want to talk about is what did that progression feel like for you? What did it look like with you realizing this is what I want to do? And then maybe even a little bit about what it's like to be in that role versus what you may have thought it was like.
And I think we're still building that role. I don't think that we've got it all ironed out yet, but yeah, when I first started, I was still actually running board and drive job site, and another foreman finishing up one of the other sites I had started, and so we were doing actually three at one point, where I was running one and helping guys run other ones, until we got to the point where we actually had guys running sites and me overseeing those guys and helping them run sites.
And what's interesting, I think part of that transition, at least from my perspective, was us not necessarily recognizing your ability probably when you joined us. We hired you for a thing we needed, and you were way qualified for that spot. We needed a foreman, right? We needed a working foreman, someone who would not only oversee their portion of their work or a crew, but would be able to jump into a machine, actually be able to do some of the work themselves. And in our minds when we hired you, that's the spot we needed you for.
Right.
But quickly realized that not only based on our own, existing other deficiencies or needs, that not only could you oversee your crew, but you could oversee multiple crews, sometimes not in the same locations like you're talking about. You're running from site to site to oversee foremen or crews at each site because we've got, not enough formality at times in what we're trying to accomplish. But it's sort of been a progression, I think, in two different ways of us recognizing what you're capable of, or as you continue to prove it to us, really. But two, is like that empowerment piece of being able to give up enough authority and control at the right times, so that you really can sort of take that growth and run with it.
Yeah, it was one of the things that actually came up in a meeting we had last week. I realized that I don't know that and I said this to Bryan and Ford. I said, I don't know that I've told anybody that Scott is the general superintendent. I said, I told Scott, and we sat down and we had a meeting and we said, here's going to be the changes in what your responsibilities are, and here's what our expectations are. And Scott was on board with that being the case. But I said, I don't know, with my lack of formality, we didn't actually make an announcement. We didn't actually say, use the portal or any other means that we have of getting information out to everybody to say, Scott's been promoted. He's not just a site superintendent. Scott is the general superintendent of commercial. And I said, as I was sitting in this meeting, I literally said, I don't know that I've ever told anyone other than Brad that Scott's the general superintendent. I mean, I think I probably told Mike, so the people that were immediately like adjacent to me that I interact with every day, I told, but all of the people who have to report to Scott may not know that Scott's the general superintendent. Now, I assume that Scott or someone told them, but I was like, this is crazy. How can I expect, and it's sort of that, honestly, Scott, that bled into a conversation that had I told anybody what I expected out of Brad, and it really made me like introspectively take a look and say, okay, my desire to just get things done and to not focus on what anyone's role is, what anyone's title is, because it doesn't really matter to me in the end of the day. I say it all the time. If the pipe layer doesn't show up, you can have 5 superintendents and it may not matter. You're not gonna get anything done. So I never look at the titles as like a structural thing vertically. I look at it as each of us has to do our job. And but it doesn't change the fact that I didn't tell anybody. So part of the reason that I wanted to sit down with Scott was to talk to the team on the podcast about the opportunity that exists in Berg for vertical growth, opportunity. We talk about growth all the time. We talk about opportunity. And Scott Gardner made the point that we show a lot of horizontal growth, that we get bigger. But how many of the guys have really ascended? And we've had guys that have done it. Um, and it's one of the things that's quite honestly tricky. I mean, Cooper Jones, Cooper's not with us anymore. And Cooper was one of my favorite people just because he started with us so young and he was in landfill as I was really learning and building what we were going to do, and Cooper did a great job and he was always successful. But when he got to like the near the apex of what he wanted to be, he realized what it actually cost as a person, as a human, to be in that role, that is not quite Scott's role, but he was working towards Gary Rambo, which is a similar role, but with less crews. Scott has the most crews of anybody. And I realized that that was the other thing I wanted to make sure we talked about was to let people sort of feel, what it feels like. Scott feels stressed. Scott feels, the pressure of people needing things and multiple GCs and owners and our own foreman and the project managers wanting things. He has to field all that. But with it, Scott has the authority to make virtually any decision in what we're doing operationally. And as I say, with our decentralized command setup, if Scott's going to ask me what we should do to put a piece of pipe in the ground, then we already have a big problem because Scott's put a lot of pipe in the ground and I have not. If Scott's going to ask me any number of questions, I probably don't have a better answer than Scott. Even if we get into landfill, where I know the landfill better than Scott does. If Scott was in the field every day, talking to the foreman, talking to the guys, and seeing the site, he might still be the better one to make the decision because he's closer to that decision than I've become. So I wanted to make sure that everybody heard it from me of what my expectation was and the level of trust that I have in Scott and what I want him to do. But I also wanted Scott to be able to talk about, you know, sort of how he sees it going as he points out, as we develop this role to really develop a general superintendent who genuinely has the authority to oversee the company.
Feel like we're doing a lot of training. We're bringing other guys to make them, like we're starting guys as laborers, and we're giving the opportunity to run equipment. Some of them get better at it quicker than others. We're also starting, with younger foremen that are carrying out a lot of responsibilities, and as long as somebody's there to help them make bigger decisions and stuff, that's what this role is, really, to help guide the other guys to the growth that we need to maintain our customers. And
A lot of that support looks like affirmation, right? I mean, I think one of the things you're trying to say there, Dan, is like, Scott's got to call you for support. Maybe he knows the answer to the question. He's just looking for affirmation. He's looking for confirmation that you agree it's the right path to take. And that's, I think, one of the keys that the growth of your role, Scott, has really shown some of our younger folks. I think about like the Andrew Geezys of our world. And, Andrew's a great guy. He knows a lot of stuff. And from a leadership perspective, maybe just a little bit raw. But what he needs is that affirmation and confirmation from guys like yourself that he's on the right path. He's doing the right things. He's making the right decisions.
Well, and that's such a tricky thing to have to do in Scott's role, because if you're going to be Andrew Geezy, Andrew has no problem making decisions. He has no problem taking ownership of the decision he made, but he only has the number of years that he's been doing this of experience that he's using to make that decision. Whereas Scott has a lot more. So it's a funny thing where Scott has to develop a level of trust as a general superintendent with especially the younger foremen that they're willing to ask. And then he has to also be willing to share the information, right? Because this is something that's been long thought to be a problem in our industry, is the tribal nature of keeping what you know. So you learn all these things over the course of the years, and then people don't want to teach other people the thing. Because if I teach you, then you know what I know. So then it makes me less valuable somehow. But what Scott's been able to do is demonstrate that he has no hesitation in trying to teach the younger guys how to do these things. And that sort of speaks to a line that I've said lately, which is Ford, Bryan, and I, and Scott, all similar age, we are not going to retire because of someone older than us. We're going to be able to retire someday and do whatever it is we like to do outside of work because we've built a team who can do the things that we did before and then grow into our roles and then slowly work ourselves out of a job and invest in our own lives and our own retirement in a way that we can spend our post work retirement years doing what we want to do. But the only way that that happens easily without injuring the company, because I do value Berg construction. Like, if I thought me leaving would hurt the company someday, I wouldn't leave. I would just keep working. And there's a lot of people that end up that way. You know what I mean? There's a lot of guys that just stay and keep working forever because they don't work themselves out of a job. And Scott's been very free with training a lot of these guys, giving them information, being open with them, and that's part of the role. You don't necessarily think about it. I mean, as general superintendent, you think I got to make sure they have what they need. They got to know where they're going. But I mean, if you can speak to that, part of it is being willing to teach these guys what it is that you know.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, I have to make sure we have the right guys and the right equipment, on the right sites. But a lot of the guys, they like, I don't tell them necessarily this is what we got to do. A lot of times we'll just have a conversation and they'll end up knowing what the right answer is. We just talk through it until they realize, oh, I know what to do, because me telling them isn't as good as them as talking through the options and then figuring it out.
Yeah, for sure. Teach a man to fish. So, yeah. And the other thing that's interesting you said there, Dan, is, I think some of that tribal nature, holding things so close to the vest, I think we see a lot of that in trying to retain employees, right? We're worried sometimes. I'm not saying here at Berg Construction. I think we do a pretty good job of this, but sometimes people are worried that you teach somebody enough that they're going to leave and go do something else. And I think one of the realizations we've come to here is we certainly hope that we can be a good enough employer that everyone we've got wants to retire here, right? But that doesn't change the fact that we could empower them enough to leave. And, and if they do, we hope it's to do something great in their lives somewhere else. Not that we'd want them to go, but it's going to happen. We're going to give people the skills and the education, the knowledge, the experiences that they need to be successful here, which probably makes them, eligible to be successful a lot of places. And, our goal is to just treat them well enough that this is the place they want to be. And if not, then hopefully we've helped them make something better anyways.
Yeah, for sure. We've been talking about that lately too. We want to be the employer of choice in this area, right? Like, we'd like to figure out ways to differentiate ourselves, to make ourselves noticeably different, that there's some way that it's better to work at Berg. And as a leadership team, we struggle with that, to try and figure out, like, what does that mean? Like, what is most valuable to an employee that we could provide that someone else might not provide. And there's a lot of really solid companies out there all trying to do the same thing. The nature of the labor market is pushing it further, but it's not an easy thing to figure out, but it's important. I mean, it's one of the most important things, because 9 times out of 10, what you hear from our team is one thing that would make it better is continuity. They don't often say continuity, but they say, like, if we had the same guys every day, we had the same team over a course of time, we'd know what each other was doing. And I 100% agree. We're just trying to figure out how to do that, how to get there. And I think part of it is training people that they're better, that they're good enough that they could leave, but try and create an environment where they don't want to. They want to stay and be part of the team.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know,
That's a
Scott,
real
is there anything
challenge.
else you're thinking of from a general superintendent standpoint or from a growth standpoint? Anything that you'd want to sort of get out there, or just introduce yourself as general superintendent, Scott Gross?
Scott Gersh, general superintendent.
There
Berg.
you go.
Nice to
Berg.
meet you.
For the first time.
Yeah, and I think one way that we do keep the guys happy is we treat them fairly. We don't go around raising our voices. We don't scream and yell. If somebody does something wrong, we would just address that, and you address it in a way that you would want to be addressed as well. And I think that across the board, that's how our company operates, which I think is important, especially to the younger guys. So.
Yeah. Good. Well, Scott, we certainly appreciate you taking some time today to join us. I know you got a busy schedule, and we don't want to keep you too long here, but thanks, folks, for tuning in today, and we hope to catch you again on another episode soon.